January 1916, the Western Front. Dawn arrives without color. A pale light settles over a landscape broken into lines and angles, trenches carved in the earth that no longer remembers grass. Mud holds everything in place. Boots, rifles, bodies. The air is heavy with moisture and smoke. And somewhere behind the lines, artillery crews check their watches. Time here is not abstract. It is mechanical, measured, obeyed. A pocket watch clicks shut in a gloved hand. Barrage schedules are fixed. Assaults timed to the minute. Lives arranged according to a plan drawn far from this ground. When the guns begin, they do so not from anger or fear, but from precision. Steel rises and falls by the clock. Men wait, not for victory, but for the moment the hands align. In the trenches, seconds stretch. Minutes carry weight. Each tick signals another calculation already made, another order already signed. The war does not hesitate. It advances on schedule. And as the clock continues its steady movement, indifferent and exact, the first truth of this war becomes clear. Time will not save them. It will only keep counting. By the summer of 1914, Europe believed it understood war. For decades, the continent had measured power in factories, railways, and mobilization timetables. Industrial output was no longer just economic strength. It was military promise. Steel could be counted. Coal could be stockpiled. Men could be summoned by telegram and moved by train with mathematical certainty. War, in the minds of planners, had become something that could be scheduled. Germany's general staff built its strategy around the clock. The Schlieffen Plan was not merely a battle concept. It was a timetable. Trains would move divisions across borders on precise days. March rates were calculated. Supply flows were synchronized. Victory was expected not through improvisation, but through punctuality. France answered with its own rigid doctrine. Plan 17, rooted in speed, offensive spirit, and rapid concentration of forces. Russia mobilized according to vast, inflexible schedules. Austria-Hungary followed similar logic. Each nation believed that once the clock started, stopping would be impossible and therefore unnecessary. This belief was reinforced by history. The wars of the 19th century had been short. Decisive battles had resolved conflicts in weeks or months. Industrialization, military thinkers assumed, would only accelerate outcomes. Faster transport, faster communication, faster decisions. The clock was an ally. When the July crisis spiraled into war, those assumptions hardened into inevitability. Diplomacy became secondary to mobilization schedules. Political leaders spoke of days and hours lost. Germany declared war on Russia not because negotiations had ended, but because railway timetables demanded action. Once mobilization began, it was said it could not be reversed. The clock ruled policy. By August, millions of men were moving. Trains crisscrossed Europe without pause. Uniforms were issued in bulk. Rifles stamped by factories were handed to recruits who had trained for months or not at all. Armies collided with a confidence born from charts and projections. Commanders believed that momentum would carry them through. It did not. By the end of 1914, the illusion of movement had collapsed into stasis. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, armies dug into the earth. Trenches multiplied, connected by communication lines and supply routes, turning the landscape into a permanent military machine. The front solidified not because either side chose to stop, but because neither could move forward without catastrophic cost. And yet, the clocks kept ticking. High command refused to abandon the logic that had brought them here. If breakthroughs had failed, the answer was not reconsideration, but recalculation. More shells, longer barges, better timing. Attacks would be synchronized down to the minute. Artillery would soften the enemy for hours, sometimes days, before infantry advanced according to schedule. Time became doctrine. By 1915, war planning revolved around measurements. The duration of bombardments, the distance infantry could cover in a set number of minutes, the rate at which men could be replaced. Casualties were recorded in daily tallies, then folded into future projections. Losses were no longer a shock. They were variables. Soldiers at the front began to understand something their commanders did not. The war was not progressing. It was consuming. Each offensive promised movement, and delivered only repetition. The same ground was taken, lost, and retaken. The same hours were lived again and again under fire. What had begun as a race had become endurance. And as 1916 approached, the belief hardened that time itself would decide the war, not through speed but through attrition. If one side could outlast the other, if its factories could run longer, if its population could endure more loss, then eventually the clock would favor it. This conviction set the stage for what came next. Battles designed not to break the enemy's line, but to wear it down minute by minute, day by day, until collapse seemed inevitable. By 1916, the war had fully surrendered itself to time. The front lines no longer shifted with strategy or surprise, but with calendars. Winter slowed operations. Spring promised renewed effort. Summer was reserved for great offensives, each announced weeks in advance by the accumulation of men, guns, and shells. Nothing was sudden. Everything was prepared. The clock did not just measure the war, it organized it. In headquarters far behind the front, maps were pinned with colored markers and annotated with dates. Attacks were planned not around opportunity, but around readiness. Artillery units were assigned firing. Schedules that ran like railway timetables. Barges would begin at dawn, lift at prearranged intervals, and advance forward at a fixed pace. Infantry would follow behind the explosions, stepping into the smoke when the minute hand reached its mark. This was the creeping barrage, war synchronized to the second. The theory was simple. Precision would replace chaos. If shells fell exactly on time, the enemy would be suppressed. If men advanced exactly on time, resistance would collapse. Human uncertainty would be disciplined by machinery and clocks. Reality resisted. Artillery fire churned the ground into mud, destroying the very terrain infantry needed to cross. Shells fell short or long. Communications broke under bombardment. Watches shattered. Orders arrived late, or not at all. Men emerged from trenches into landscapes so altered that no map could describe them. Timing, once precise on paper, dissolved under fire. Still, the schedules remained. At Verdun, beginning in February 1916, the German High Command pursued a new logic of time. The objective was not territorial conquest, but exhaustion. The battle was designed to force the French army to defend the symbol, committing men continuously until it bled itself dry. The phrase attributed to German planners, to bleed France white, captured the cold arithmetic of attrition. Time was the weapon. Every hour France held Verdun, more men would die. France answered with its own commitment to time. Rotational systems were established to cycle divisions in and out of the front, ensuring endurance rather than relief. The battle became a contest, not a maneuver, but a persistence. Months passed. Casualties accumulated. The line barely moved. On the Somme, launched in July 1916, the logic reached its most brutal expression. A week-long artillery barrage was scheduled to obliterate German defenses. Over 5 million shells were fired according to strict timetables. Officers carried synchronized watches. Infantry assault waves were ordered to advance at fixed intervals. When the whistles blew, the clock had spoken. The results were catastrophic. German defenses, dug deep, survived. Machine guns emerged intact. Advancing troops, bound by orders and timing, moved forward even as casualties mounted. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, an outcome known within hours, recorded, and absorbed into ongoing plans. The clock did not stop. What made these battles uniquely modern was not just the scale of death, but its administration. Casualties were logged daily. Replacement rates were calculated. Commanders discussed losses in percentages and projections. Time allowed suffering to become normalized. A day of heavy casualties was tragic, but expected. A week was tolerable. A month became routine. For soldiers, time lost its ordinary meaning. Days were marked by bombardments, nights by repair and waiting. Watches were checked not to know the hour, but to anticipate fire. The ticking became constant, sometimes imagined, sometimes real, echoing in dugouts and mines alike. The war had become a machine that consumed time and lives at a steady rate. And yet, belief endured. Leaders on all sides convinced themselves that just a little more time, one more offensive, one more month of pressure, would bring decision. The The clock, they believed, would eventually reward perseverance. This belief would be tested from multiple angles: human, tactical, technological, and moral, each revealing how deeply time had come to govern not only the war, but the thinking of those who fought it. The human cost of the ticking clock was felt first at ground level. For the men in the trenches, time did not advance. It circled. Hours were spent waiting, pressed into damp earth, listening to artillery that followed patterns learned by ear. Barges began and ended with unsettling regularity. Soldiers knew when fire would intensify, when it would lift, and when it would return. The predictability offered no comfort. It only confirmed that suffering was scheduled. Letters home often marked time obsessively. Days since arrival, weeks without relief, minutes between shell bursts. Soldiers wrote of watches stopped by shrapnel, of clocks buried in ruined villages, of church bells silenced by artillery. The war erased familiar markers of civilian life, replacing them with a mechanical rhythm imposed from above. Tactically, the clock was meant to impose order on chaos. Commanders believed synchronized assaults could overcome entrenched defenses. Infantry waves were timed to exploit artillery fire. Reserves were committed according to prearranged hours. Even withdrawals were scheduled. Flexibility was sacrificed for predictability, not because it worked, but because it could be controlled. This rigidity proved fatal. When conditions changed, as they always did, orders did not. Units advanced into fire because the schedule demanded it. Attacks continued despite obvious failure, because stopping would disrupt the larger timetable. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged. Time had authority. Men did not. Technology reinforced this mindset. Industrial warfare produced weapons in quantities never seen before. Artillery pieces fired by calculation rather than observation. Shell production was measured by output per day. Machine guns, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, transformed time itself into a killing factor. A few seconds of exposure could end dozens of lives. Leadership remained distant both physically and psychologically. Generals measured progress by reports arriving hours late. They trusted clocks and plans more than fragmented frontline accounts. To admit that timing itself was flawed would mean admitting that the entire logic of the war was broken. The enemy, too, was trapped in the same system. German and Allied soldiers often attacked each other at predictable hours. Both sides synchronized their lives to the same relentless cycle of fire and movement. In this sense, the clock was impartial. It demanded sacrifice from all, without distinction. Morally, the consequences were profound. When death is expected at a certain hour, responsibility diffuses. No single decision seems decisive. Each order is justified by the schedule it follows. Shame becomes abstract, spread across days and documents rather than concentrated in a moment. And yet, beneath the system, something began to shift. Soldiers, officers, and even some planners started to sense that time was no longer a tool, but a trap. That recognition, slow and resisted, would emerge more clearly as the war continued to grind forward, revealing deeper fractures in how modern societies wage war. As the war stretched on, the leadership angle revealed a deeper unease, one that no timetable could conceal. High command across Europe had been trained in a world where control meant predictability. War colleges emphasized planning, coordination, and discipline. The clock symbolized mastery over chaos. To abandon it would mean accepting uncertainty, and uncertainty threatened authority itself. Thus, even as evidence mounted that rigid timing failed on the battlefield, senior commanders clung to it as proof of rational command. Reports from the front were filtered through layers of staff work, summarized into tables and charts. Losses were expressed in numbers per hour, ground gained in yards per day. The language of time and measurement created distance. Decisions made weeks earlier were defended because they aligned with schedules, not because they reflected conditions. When offensive stalled, the solution was rarely reconsideration. It was extension. Another day, another week, more time applied to the problem. From the enemy perspective, the experience was eerily similar. German soldiers at Verdun and the Somme described anticipating Allied attacks based on routine. Artillery preparation followed recognizable patterns. Assaults arrived on cue. Defenders synchronized their own actions accordingly, turning the attacker's timetable into an advantage. Time meant to overwhelm, instead revealed intention. Morally, the clock became a shield. Leaders spoke of necessity rather than choice. Losses were framed as unavoidable costs of a process already in motion. Once the machinery of war was running, stopping it seemed irresponsible, even dangerous. Shame dissolved into procedure, yet cracks formed. Junior officers began to adapt quietly, adjusting timings, delaying advances, or advancing early when opportunity appeared. These small acts of defiance hinted at a growing awareness. Survival required breaking rhythm. War, it seemed, could not be mastered by schedule alone. For societies at home, time also changed meaning. Newspapers reported casualty figures daily. Families marked weeks without letters. Factories ran shifts around the clock. Civilian life synchronized itself to the war's demands, normalizing endurance and delay. The longer the war lasted, the more its continuation felt inevitable. By late 1916, the clock had proven both powerful and cruel. It enabled nations to sustain conflict on an unprecedented scale, but also trapped them within it. The belief that time would eventually deliver victory had not yet collapsed, but it was fraying. That belief would face its greatest test at moments when the cost of persistence became impossible to ignore, when the clock's steady ticking collided with reality in ways no schedule could absorb. The turning point did not arrive suddenly. It announced itself slowly, through accumulation. At Verdun, time was no longer counted in days, but in endurance. Beginning in February 1916, the battle unfolded as a continuous strain rather than a single event. Artillery fired almost without pause. Roads became arteries of movement, carrying men forward and back in endless rotation. One route, the Zwhere, operated day and night, regulated by strict timing to keep supplies flowing. Every few seconds, another truck passed. Time was rationed. Space was secondary. German planners believed the French army would eventually break under the pressure of constant engagement. The longer Verdun held, the more lives it would consume. The clock, once again, was expected to decide. But the French response inverted the logic. Instead of allowing units to be destroyed, they rotated divisions with clockwork regularity. Survival became scheduled. No unit stayed long enough to collapse completely. The result was stalemate intensified. Both sides lost hundreds of thousands of men. The front barely shifted. Verdun did not resolve the war. It redefined it. Time was no longer accelerating toward decision. It was expanding, stretching the conflict into something without visible end. On the Somme, the illusion of timing collapsed even more violently. The offensive was meant to relieve pressure on Verdun and break the deadlock. British and French forces committed unprecedented resources. Preparations lasted months. Artillery timetables were refined. Infantry rehearsed movements, synchronized to the second. When the attack began on July 1st, 1916, the clock dictated everything. Men advanced at prescribed moments, burdened with equipment calculated for orderly progress rather than survival. Machine guns shattered the rhythm instantly. Units were cut down within minutes. Timetables dissolved into confusion, but the orders did not change. Reinforcements advanced because the schedule demanded continuation. The first day's casualties forced a reckoning that could not be hidden by charts. Nearly 60,000 British casualties in a single day was not just a number, it was a rupture. Officers who survived began to question assumptions long held as doctrine. The clock, once a symbol of control, now exposed its own failure. Yet the offensive continued for months. This was a true turning point. Not a victory or defeat, but a realization spreading unevenly through ranks and governments. Time was not neutral. It was complicit. Every additional day multiplied suffering without guaranteeing progress. Attrition had become an end in itself. By the end of 1916, something fundamental had shifted. The belief that war could be mastered through scheduling alone had been shaken, though not abandoned. The clock still ticked, but now its sound carried doubt. That doubt would shape how the war was fought and remembered. From this point forward, as consequences unfolded far beyond the battlefield. As 1916 drew toward its close, the consequences of time-driven warfare became impossible to ignore. The Somme ground on through autumn, each phase carefully planned, each objective modestly adjusted, yet the underlying logic remained unchanged. Attacks were rescheduled rather than reconsidered. Gains were measured in hundreds of yards. Losses accumulated by the tens of thousands. The calendar advanced. The front did not. What changed was perception. Officers began recording a different kind of data, not just casualties and ground gained, but exhaustion. Units required longer recovery. Morale eroded. Replacement troops arrived less prepared, less confident. The war's demand for time exceeded what human bodies and minds could endure indefinitely. In Germany, confidence and attrition faltered. Verdun had failed to break France. The Somme drained German manpower at a rate that alarmed planners. Industrial capacity remained strong, but trained soldiers were not machines. Time, once assumed to favor the strongest economy, now threatened to expose vulnerability. Across the Channel, Britain confronted a parallel truth. The Somme revealed the limits of enthusiasm and mass mobilization. Citizen soldiers could not be spent endlessly without consequence. Public awareness grew as casualty lists lengthened. Time at home became anxious, measured by newspaper headlines and telegram deliveries. France, bled but unbroken, understood perhaps most clearly what time now meant. Survival required adaptation. Commanders quietly adjusted tactics, shortened bombardments, encouraged initiative, and experimented with combined arms. These changes were incremental, cautious, but they marked a departure from blind adherence to schedules. The clock did not disappear. It remained central to planning, but its authority weakened. Time became a factor to be managed, not a master to be obeyed. This shift was subtle, uneven, and incomplete. The war would continue for 2 more years. But the faith that time alone would deliver victory had been broken. What remained was endurance without illusion. By the end of 1916, the shame implied by the ticking clock had taken shape. Not shame of defeat, but shame of persistence. The recognition that millions had been committed to a system that valued continuation over comprehension. The war had not ended, but its meaning had changed. And as the consequences unfolded, societies would be forced to reckon with what had been sacrificed in obedience to time. When the war finally moved beyond the killing grounds of 1916, it carried the weight of time with it. The years that followed did not abandon the logic of endurance, but they adapted it. New tactics emerged, smaller units, greater flexibility, closer coordination between infantry, artillery, and eventually tanks. These changes acknowledged quietly that rigid timing had failed. War could not be commanded solely by the clock. It required responsiveness to conditions as they unfolded. Yet the cost of learning this lesson had already been paid. By the end of the war in 1918, more than 9 million soldiers were dead. Many millions more were wounded, missing, or psychologically shattered. These figures were not the result of a single catastrophe, but of countless days governed by schedules that demanded continuation. Official reports reflected this reality in measured language. Casualties were broken down by month. Production statistics tracked shells fired per week. Government spoke of sacrifices spread over time, as if duration softened loss. The clock allowed societies to endure the unacceptable by dividing it into manageable portions. Strategically, the war's conclusion did not bring closure. Armistice came not through decisive breakthrough, but through exhaustion. Germany collapsed internally as much as militarily. Allies prevailed because their resources and populations outlasted their opponents. Time had decided the war, but not in the way planners imagined. For soldiers who survived, time became fragmented. Years lost at the front could not be recovered. Many returned home to lives that no longer fit them. Memories resurfaced in rhythms. The interval between shell bursts, the pause before attack, the moment a watch stopped working. Trauma lingered because it had been experienced repetitively over long periods without resolution. At home, the war reshaped how societies understood responsibility. Leaders were judged not only for decisions, but for delays and persistence. Questions emerged. When should the war have stopped? When did continuation become negligence? These questions had no simple answers, but they reflected a growing discomfort with the logic that had sustained the conflict. The clock, once a symbol of progress and efficiency, had become associated with waste. Time had not saved lives through order. It had enabled their steady consumption. This reckoning did not end in 1918. Its consequences extended into politics, memory, and future conflict, shaping how the war was explained, justified, and remembered. The legacy of that reckoning settled slowly, long after the guns fell silent. In the years following the armistice, governments struggled to explain what 4 years of time had accomplished. Victory speeches spoke of honor and necessity, yet beneath them lay unease. Memorials rose across Europe, each engraved with dates that seemed to stretch endlessly. 1914 to 1918, years that consumed a generation. Time itself became the epitaph. Military institutions absorbed the lessons unevenly. Official histories acknowledged tactical failures, but rarely confronted the deeper flaw, the belief that duration could substitute for judgment. Timetables were revised, doctrines rewritten, yet the culture of planning endured. The clock was not discarded. It was rehabilitated. Future wars would promise better timing, smarter schedules, more humane efficiency. For civilians, memory followed a different path. Anniversaries marked battles whose outcomes were often unclear even in retrospect. Verdun and the Somme became symbols not of triumph, but of endurance and loss. Their names evoked months rather than moments, attrition rather than decision. Time defined their meaning. The psychological aftermath revealed the cost of prolonged exposure to mechanized rhythm. What later generations would call shell shock emerged not from singular terror, but from repetition. The body and mind, subjected to constant cycles of anticipation and violence, broke under the weight of unending time. Healing proved difficult because the trauma had no clear beginning or end. Politically, the shame embedded in duration influenced post-war settlements. The desire to justify sacrifice hardened attitudes. Concessions seemed to cheapen loss. The longer the war had lasted, the more absolute its outcomes needed to appear. This rigidity shaped peace as surely as schedules had shaped war. And beneath it all, the clock kept ticking. Its sound echoed in interwar Europe. In deadlines imposed, reparations scheduled, grievances deferred rather than resolved. Time, once again, was asked to manage problems born of human choice. The same fate resurfaced, that if events were paced correctly, catastrophe could be avoided. History would test that belief again. The First World War left behind more than ruins and graves. It left a warning about obedience to process without reflection, about the danger of allowing time to replace responsibility. The clock that kept ticking through the trenches became a silent witness, measuring not only hours and days, but the cost of surrendering judgment to inevitability. When the war ended, the clock did not. It continued on mantles and wrists, in factories and offices, unchanged by what it had measured. Seconds passed as they always had. Minutes accumulated without memory. Time itself bore no scars. The shame of the First World War did not lie only in its brutality, but in its persistence, a conflict sustained not by decisive necessity, but by the belief that endurance would justify itself, that if enough time passed, meaning would emerge from suffering. It did not. The men who died did so on schedules drawn far from the sound of gunfire. Their deaths were spaced across calendars in a way that made them manageable, acceptable, and therefore repeatable. The clock allowed loss to be absorbed rather than confronted. Yet time also preserved truth. It revealed patterns. It exposed illusions. It showed that industrial power without moral restraint becomes a machine that demands constant fuel. In the trenches, that fuel was human life. The war taught that freedom and responsibility cannot be deferred indefinitely. When judgment is postponed in favor of procedure, when decisions are justified by momentum rather than conscience, time becomes an accomplice. The ticking that governed the Western Front still echoes, not as sound, but as warning. It reminds us that progress measured only in duration is not progress at all. That endurance without reflection leads not to victory, but to repetition. History does not ask us to stop the clock. It asks us to listen to it. Because when time keeps ticking and nothing changes, the cost is never abstract. It is counted in lives.